The classroom erupted with laughter as Zephyr towered over Ms. Frost, knocking her teaching materials to the floor. "What are you going to do about it?" he sneered, stepping closer to the quiet teacher everyone had dismissed as weak. In that instant, something shifted in her eyes. With one fluid motion, too fast for anyone to follow, she had him secured in a professional hold he couldn't escape despite his size. The laughter died instantly. No one moved. The substitute teacher they had mocked for weeks suddenly revealed skills only taught to elite military operatives. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories about hidden strength and quiet dignity speak to you, consider subscribing for more accounts of remarkable individuals whose pasts contain extraordinary chapters. The fifth period bell at Westlake High School rang with the jarring insistence of a fire alarm, sending students scurrying through the hallways. Most moved with purpose toward their next classes, but the group heading for room 237 dragged their feet, approaching the doorway with the reluctance of prisoners marching toward their cells. Room 237 housed the school's notorious remedial English class, a holding pen for students who had either failed regular English courses or caused too many disruptions to remain in mainstream classes. Inside, a woman stood at the teacher's desk, arranging a neat stack of paperback copies of The Things They Carried. Araceli Frost looked nothing like what the students expected of their new substitute teacher. At 32, she was younger than most of Westlake's faculty, with dark hair pulled back in a simple, neat bun and minimal makeup on her olive-toned skin. Her posture was impeccable, spine straight, shoulders squared, feet planted firmly as though prepared to hold her ground against an advancing army rather than a group of disinterested teenagers. The students filtered in, immediately testing boundaries. Two boys took seats on top of desks rather than in chairs. A girl turned her desk to face the wall instead of the front of the room. Several students had headphones on, with music playing loudly enough for others to hear. A paper airplane sailed across the room, followed by snickers when it landed on the floor near Araceli's feet. She observed all of this without comment, her expression neutral as she continued arranging the books into perfectly aligned stacks. The security officer, Mr. Helios, poked his head through the doorway. A veteran of 15 years at Westlake, he had developed a sixth sense for which classrooms might need intervention. His eyes swept over the chaos emerging before the final bell had even rung. "Need any help getting started, Ms. Frost?" he asked, clearly expecting her to accept his offer. New teachers, especially substitutes, rarely decline backup when facing room 237. "I'll be fine, thank you," Araceli replied, with a quiet confidence that made Mr. Helios raise an eyebrow. Her voice was calm but clear, carrying just far enough to reach him without shouting. "Well, I'll be doing hall rounds if you need me," he said, lingering a moment longer before reluctantly continuing his patrol. The final bell rang as the last few stragglers entered. Among them was Zephyr Dela Cruz, a senior who should have graduated the previous year, but whose spotty attendance and discipline issues had left him short on credits. At 17, he already stood over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and confident stride of someone accustomed to physical dominance. His designer clothes and expensive watch broadcast a message about his priorities, image over education. A small group of students perked up at his entrance, clearly his loyal audience. Zephyr slouched into a desk in the back row, sprawling his legs into the aisle and tipping the chair back on 2 legs. He made no attempt to lower his voice as he commented to a friend. "Another new one? I give her a week, tops." Araceli closed the classroom door and moved to the center of the room. Unlike most teachers who retreated behind their desks when faced with a difficult class, she positioned herself directly in the student space, standing with the same straight posture she had maintained while arranging books. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice at the same measured volume she had used with Mr. Helios. Several students in the front had to lean forward to hear her. "My name is Ms. Frost. I'll be your English teacher while Mr. Bernard recovers from his surgery." A student in the middle row called out without raising his hand. "How long are you stuck with us?" "Mr. Bernard's recovery is expected to take at least 8 weeks, Araceli replied, unfazed by the interruption. "So, we have plenty of time to accomplish our goals for this semester." The casual dismissal of the student's attempt to provoke her drew a few curious glances. Typically, new substitutes either overreacted to minor provocations or desperately tried to befriend the class. Araceli did neither. Have you ever taught before? Asked a girl with purple streaks in her hair and multiple piercings decorating her ears. I've worked with specialized teams in challenging environments, Araceli answered, the deliberate vagueness of her response causing a few students to exchange puzzled looks. This is my first position at Westlake. She turned to write her name on the whiteboard, and as she reached up, the sleeve of her blouse slid back slightly, revealing part of a significant scar circling her wrist. Several students noticed it before she lowered her arm and the sleeve fell back into place. Araceli began distributing the paperback books, moving efficiently through the rows. When she reached Zephyr's desk, he made a show of ignoring her outstretched hand, forcing her to place the book on his desk. As she did, he maintained direct eye contact, a challenge that most teachers would either confront or avoid. Araceli simply met his gaze briefly, her expression revealing nothing, before she moved on to the next student. The quiet standoff was interrupted when Zephyr suddenly stuck out his foot, causing another student to trip. The boy's books went flying, scattering across the floor. Laughter erupted as the student scrambled to gather his belongings, his face flushed with embarrassment. The class fell silent, watching to see how the new teacher would handle this first direct challenge to her authority. Instead of calling Zephyr out or sending him to the office, the expected responses, Araceli calmly walked over and began helping the student collect his books. "Thank you for demonstrating an important point, Mr. De La Cruz," she said without looking up at Zephyr. "Literature often explores how people respond to others in difficult moments. Some characters rise to challenges with dignity, while others make choices that diminish themselves." The comment was delivered without heat or judgment, yet several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Zephyr's smirk faltered momentarily before he doubled down. "Whatever, this class is a joke anyway," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. From the doorway came a throat-clearing sound. Vice Principal Dr. Quincy Barlow stood observing the class, his expression suggesting he had expected to find complete chaos. Instead, despite Zephyr's disruption, most students had books open on their desks and were watching Araceli with varying degrees of curiosity. "Everything under control, Ms. Frost?" Dr. Barlow asked, his tone indicating he had anticipated needing to intervene. "We're just getting started with our semester reading list," Araceli replied, with the same calm she had maintained throughout the class. "Did you need something, Dr. Barlow?" The vice principal seemed momentarily taken aback by her composure. "Just checking in on our new faculty. Carry on." As the door closed behind him, Araceli returned to the front of the room. "Let's begin with a brief overview of Tim O'Brien's work. By the end of this unit, you'll understand how the burdens we carry, visible and invisible, shape who we become." For the remainder of the period, she conducted class with the same quiet intensity, never raising her voice regardless of the occasional disruptions. Rather than engaging directly with troublemakers, she simply continued teaching, acknowledging those who participated and moving forward with the lesson. The approach left many students off balance, uncertain how to provoke a reaction from a teacher who seemed impervious to typical antagonism. When the bell finally rang, students gathered their belongings with the usual end-of-period rush. Araceli stood by the door, making brief eye contact with each student as they left. When Zephyr approached, she spoke just loudly enough for him to hear. "I look forward to seeing what you're capable of when you decide to participate constructively, Mr. De La Cruz." Zephyr paused, thrown off by the comment. It wasn't the reprimand he had expected, nor was it the fearful avoidance he had grown accustomed to from substitute teachers. Before he could formulate a response, the crowd of students pushed him forward into the hallway. Araceli was gathering her materials when another teacher appeared in the doorway. Octavia Reed taught honors English in the classroom across the hall, and curiosity had clearly gotten the better of her. "So, you survived fifth period with the infamous room 237 crew," Octavia said, entering the classroom. "How on earth did you manage Zephyr? He drove the last 3 substitutes to quit." Araceli sorted papers into a precise stack before responding. "He's testing boundaries. Most of them are." "Testing boundaries is putting it mildly," Octavia replied with a short laugh. "Zephyr De La Cruz is the reason Mr. Bernard needed stress leave disguised as surgery. That kid has been terrorizing teachers since freshman year." "I've worked with more difficult cases in more challenging environments," Araceli said, offering no further explanation as she placed her materials into a messenger bag. Octavia studied the new substitute with undisguised curiosity. Well, the pool in the teacher's lounge has the average substitute lasting 3 days in room 237. I might have to change my bet. 2 weeks later, Araceli sat in the English department office during her free period, reviewing student essays with methodical precision. Her red pen moved across the papers in quick, efficient strokes. Not the lengthy comments many teachers wrote, but brief, targeted feedback focused on specific improvements. Department Chair Thaddeus Whalen paused by her desk, coffee mug in hand, glancing down at her work. The scuttlebutt is that 237's attendance numbers are up since you took over, he remarked. That's practically unheard of for that particular group. Barlow says there have been fewer incident reports, too. Araceli continued marking papers, completing her thought before looking up. They're responding well to clear expectations. I've been teaching for 27 years, Ms. Frost, and clear expectations alone don't produce the results I'm hearing about with that particular class, Whalen said, studying her with professional curiosity. Where did you teach before this position? Various training environments, Araceli replied, her pen poised over the next essay. This is my first formal classroom position. Whalen opened his mouth to press further, but a commotion in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Through the office window, they could see Zephyr looming over a smaller student, backing him against the lockers while a circle of onlookers gathered. 2 teachers had already approached, issuing the typical ineffective warnings that Zephyr habitually ignored. "Excuse me," Araceli said, setting down her pen and rising from her chair with the same perfect posture she always maintained. Rather than rushing to intervene or calling for administrative support, she simply walked into the hallway and positioned herself near the confrontation, saying nothing. She didn't directly engage, didn't attempt to physically separate the students, didn't raise her voice. She simply stood watching, her expression attentive but neutral. Zephyr, in the middle of a threatening comment to his victim, glanced over and noticed Araceli. Something in her steady gaze caused him to hesitate. Unlike the other teachers who were actively trying to intervene, her silent observation seemed to unnerve him more. After a moment of locked eyes, he stepped back from the smaller student. "Whatever, not worth my time anyway," he muttered, shooting a glance toward Araceli before stalking off down the hallway, his usual entourage trailing behind him. The other teachers looked at Araceli with a mixture of surprise and curiosity, but she had already turned to check on the student who had been targeted before returning to the department office without comment. That afternoon in room 237, Araceli led a discussion on the things they carried, focusing on the physical and emotional burdens soldiers bore in Vietnam. For once, the class was relatively engaged, several students offering observations about the symbolic significance of the items each character carried. The physical objects represent deeper emotional weights, Araceli explained. Lieutenant Cross carries letters from a girl who doesn't love him back. Another soldier carries his girlfriend's pantyhose around his neck as a protective talisman. These objects tell us about their fears, their hopes, what anchors them to humanity in an inhumane situation. "What would you know about what soldiers carry?" Zephyr interrupted from the back row. "You're just a substitute teacher. Have you ever even met a real soldier?" The class tensed, anticipating confrontation. Instead, Araceli regarded him thoughtfully. "Sometimes the heaviest things we carry aren't visible to others, Mr. Dela Cruz," she replied. "That's one of O'Brien's central points, the weight of experiences, memories, responsibilities, often heavier than any physical burden." Zephyr's attempt to derail the discussion faltered against her measured response. Several students who had been only half listening now turned to watch the exchange with interest. Before Zephyr could escalate further, student Indigo Merritt accidentally knocked a water bottle onto Araceli's desk while reaching for a handout. The bottle tipped, water gushing toward the stack of graded papers Araceli had spent her free period marking. What happened next caught every student's attention. Araceli moved with startling speed and precision, catching the bottle mid-spill with one hand, while simultaneously sweeping the papers to safety with the other. The movement was so fluid, so perfectly executed, it appeared almost choreographed, except for the impossibility of having anticipated the accident. For a brief moment, the classroom fell completely silent, every student registering what they had just witnessed, reflexes and coordination far beyond what one would expect from an ordinary English teacher. Araceli quickly set the water bottle upright and returned to distributing handouts as if nothing unusual had occurred. As we were discussing, she continued smoothly, the symbolic weight of objects in literature often reflects deeper psychological burdens. But something had shifted in the classroom atmosphere. Even Zephyr watched Araceli with newfound wariness, as though reassessing his initial dismissal of her as just another ineffectual substitute. Throughout the remainder of the class, students exchanged glances whenever Araceli turned to write on the board, silent communications, questioning what they had glimpsed in that moment of unguarded reflex. When the final bell rang, Araceli reminded them of their reading assignment for the following day. As students filed out, their usual rowdy exit was noticeably subdued. Conversations hushed until they were safely in the hallway, beyond her hearing. "Did you see how fast she moved? No regular teacher has reflexes like that. My brother's in the military, and that reminded me of how he reacts now." Zephyr lingered outside the classroom door, watching through the narrow window as Araceli methodically organized her materials. For the first time since she had taken over room 237, uncertainty had replaced the smug confidence in his expression. Steam rose from coffee mugs in the teacher's lounge as faculty gathered during their shared planning period. The room had the worn comfort of a space long claimed by its occupants. Mismatched furniture salvaged from various classrooms over the years. Walls decorated with student artwork and humorous teaching memes. The perpetual scent of coffee and microwave lunches. Octavia Reed stirred creamer into her mug while addressing the small group of teachers clustered around the break table. "I'm telling you, there's something unusual about Frost. Have any of you noticed her background check still hasn't cleared? Quincy mentioned it yesterday. Apparently there's some kind of holdup with verification." "Maybe she has a criminal record," suggested the chemistry teacher, earning eye rolls from his colleagues. "More likely just administrative delays," said Thaddeus Whalen, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Octavia leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I saw her at the gym yesterday evening. She was using the community center facilities rather than the fancy fitness club most people join. The woman is not just fit, she's military fit." "What does that even mean?" asked a math teacher, reaching for a donut from the box in the center of the table. "It means she wasn't just doing casual cardio. She was executing this intense circuit that looked like something out of special forces training. And she has scars. One on her wrist that I've noticed in class, but at the gym, I could see another one on her shoulder. Looked like a healed bullet wound, if you ask me." "Oh, please," Whalen scoffed. "You've been watching too many action movies. Why would someone with military training be substitute teaching remedial English?" The physical education teacher, Coach Byrne, entered the lounge in time to catch the tail end of Whalen's comment. "You talking about Frost? Because I have questions too." He poured himself coffee before continuing. "She came to the weight room during 6th period when my advanced fitness class was there. One of my students was doing pull-ups with terrible form, risking shoulder injury. Before I could correct him, she stepped in and demonstrated proper technique. So she knows how to do pull-ups," Whalen said dismissively. "That makes her mysterious how, exactly?" "It wasn't just that she could do them. It was how she explained the technique. She told my student that's how they taught proper form in training to prevent stress injuries during field operations. When I asked what kind of training she meant, she changed the subject." A thoughtful silence fell over the group until Vice Principal Barlow entered the lounge, heading straight for the coffee pot. "Dr. Barlow," Octavia called out, "any updates on Ms. Frost's background check? We were just discussing our mysterious new colleague." Barlow stirred sugar into his coffee with deliberate slowness before turning to face the faculty. "The delay appears to be bureaucratic rather than concerning. Her references checked out impeccably." "What about her teaching experience?" Whalen pressed. "She told me this is her first formal classroom position. What exactly did she do before coming here?" "Her previous employment involved training and development in specialized environments," Barlow replied, his careful phrasing suggesting he was sharing as much as he knew or was permitted to share. "What I can tell you is that attendance in room 237 has increased 12% since she took over, and incident reports are down nearly 30%. Whatever her background, her methods are effective with students other teachers have written off. They're still testing her," Coach Byrne noted. "I overheard some of Dela Cruz's crew in the hallway yesterday. They're planning something for her class today." Barlow sighed, setting down his mug. "I'll check in during 5th period. Ms. Frost may need backup, regardless of how well she's handled things so far." "I wouldn't be too sure about that," Octavia murmured. Something tells me Ms. Frost has handled worse than Zephyr Delacruz. The cafeteria buzzed with the controlled chaos of lunch period. Hundreds of teenagers packed into tables, the volume steadily rising as social dynamics played out against the backdrop of institutional food and fluorescent lighting. At a corner table, Zephyr held court with his usual group, their hunched postures and occasional glances around the room suggesting conspiracy rather than casual conversation. It's simple, Zephyr explained, keeping his voice low enough that only those at his table could hear. Every substitute has a breaking point. We just haven't found hers yet. I don't know, man, said Phoenix Coleman, a lanky junior whose normal classroom demeanor masked a sharp intelligence. Something's off about her. I don't think pushing her is smart. Zephyr scoffed. She's just another substitute trying to play tough. They all break eventually. Remember how we got rid of that guy last month? He was crying by day 3. Frost is different, Phoenix insisted. You saw how she moved when that water bottle spilled. That wasn't normal. Maybe she used to be a waitress, another student suggested with a smirk. Look, Zephyr said, leaning forward. Tomorrow, we implement the full plan. Half of us come in late, disrupting her intro. The rest keep up constant background noise. Not loud enough to get called out individually, but enough that she has to keep stopping. Then I escalate things directly. Trust me, by the end of the period, she'll either be crying or she'll have called security. Either way, we prove she's nothing special. Across the cafeteria, Araceli Frost sat alone at a small table, eating her lunch methodically, while observing the room with casual attentiveness. Unlike many teachers who used lunch as a sanctuary from students, she had chosen to eat in the cafeteria rather than the teacher's lounge. Her gaze occasionally swept over the student tables, taking in dynamics and interactions with analytical precision. At the far end of the room, 2 boys rose from their seats simultaneously, their body language escalating from disagreement to potential physical confrontation. Before any other adult in the room noticed the brewing situation, Araceli had already focused on it. When one boy shoved the other's shoulder, she didn't leap to her feet or call out. Instead, she simply made direct eye contact with the aggressor from across the room and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. Something in her gaze, calm, assured, but with unmistakable authority, caused the boy to hesitate, then step back, diffusing the situation before it required official intervention. The moment passed so quickly that few others noticed, but Coach Byrne, on lunch supervision duty, had witnessed the entire exchange. He approached Araceli's table, curiosity evident in his expression. That was impressive, he commented, nodding toward the boys who were now returning to their seats. Most situations like that end with someone in my office or Barlow's. Araceli shrugged slightly. Most confrontations are about establishing dominance or saving face. Remove those needs, and conflict often resolves itself. Sounds like military psychology, Byron observed, watching for her reaction. I was Army before teaching, 8 years, including 2 deployments. You develop a certain sense for others who've served. An astute observation, Coach, Araceli replied, without directly confirming or denying his implication. The principles of effective team building are fairly universal, whether in military units or classrooms. Is that what you did before teaching? Team building with difficult recruits? Something like that, she answered, gathering her lunch containers with the same methodical efficiency she brought to all tasks. If you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for my next class. As she walked away, Byrne watched her with narrowed eyes, noting the perfect posture, the calculated awareness of surroundings, the economical movements that suggested training beyond anything in a standard education curriculum. The following day, Room 237 erupted with coordinated chaos the moment the final bell rang. As Araceli began her introduction to the day's lesson, 6 students arrived late, each entering separately to cause maximum disruption. Throughout the room, conversations continued at a level just below what would typically trigger direct intervention. Not loud enough for individual reprimands, but sufficient to create a constant background noise that made teaching nearly impossible. Araceli observed the situation with the same calm she had maintained since her first day. Rather than raising her voice to compete with the noise, she simply continued teaching at her normal volume, addressing the handful of students who were actually paying attention. The approach was counterintuitive. Most teachers would attempt to regain control of the entire class, but she seemed content to teach effectively to a few rather than ineffectively to all. The The strategy created an unexpected dynamic. Students who had planned to ignore her found themselves straining to hear what she was saying, curiosity gradually overcoming their commitment to disruption. As more students quieted to listen, the coordinated chaos began to fragment. Zephyr, noticing the plan unraveling, decided it was time for more direct intervention. He stood from his desk and sauntered to the front of the room where Araceli was discussing symbolism in the assigned reading. "This is boring," he announced loudly, positioning himself directly in front of her, using his height advantage to physically loom over her smaller frame. "Nobody cares about some old book about Vietnam. What are you going to do about that, Ms. Frost?" The class fell silent, all eyes now on the confrontation unfolding at the front of the room. Several students shifted uncomfortably, sensing that Zephyr had crossed a line from annoying disruption to direct intimidation. Even some of his usual supporters exchanged uncertain glances. Araceli remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged as she looked up at Zephyr. "I'm going to continue teaching those who want to learn," she replied, her voice as measured as always. "You're welcome to join us whenever you're ready." Her calm response visibly frustrated Zephyr, who had expected fear, anger, or at least flustered authority. He stepped closer, deliberately invading her personal space. "What are you going to do about it?" he repeated, his voice lower, meant to intimidate. "Call security? Send me to Barlow's office? Nobody takes this class seriously. Nobody takes you seriously." The tension in the room was palpable as students watched the standoff. Araceli stood her ground without backing away, but also without escalating the confrontation. Her composed demeanor was so at odds with the situation that several students began to sense something unusual about their substitute teacher's response to direct provocation. "I take my responsibility to teach seriously," Araceli replied. "I take your potential seriously. Whether you choose to take this opportunity seriously is your decision." Zephyr's face flushed with anger at the lack of expected reaction. In a sudden motion, he reached past her toward her desk, sweeping his arm across the surface and sending her teaching materials crashing to the floor. Papers scattered, her copy of the novel skidded across the tile, and her water bottle rolled under a nearby desk. "This class is a joke, and so are you," he declared loudly, turning slightly to make sure his audience was watching his display of dominance. The atmosphere in room 237 transformed in an instant. For weeks, students had observed Ms. Frost's unusual calm, her unexpected methods, her subtle hints at a background that didn't quite align with the typical substitute teacher profile. All of these observations crystallized into a single moment of revelation. Araceli's posture shifted, a subtle change that would have been imperceptible to untrained observers, but registered immediately with several students who had family in military or law enforcement. Her weight distribution altered, her stance widened slightly, and her hands moved to a ready position that wasn't obviously defensive but created optimal response capability. Though her outward demeanor remained composed, something in her eyes changed, the professional distance giving way to focused intensity that communicated without words that a line had been crossed. The transformation was so subtle, yet so complete, that several students found themselves holding their breath, suddenly certain they were about to witness something they hadn't anticipated. Zephyr, caught up in his own performance, failed to register the shift. He turned back to face Araceli, stepping even closer, his body language making it clear that physical intimidation was now his tactic of choice. "What are you going to do about it?" he challenged for the third time. The class watched, frozen in anticipation, as the quiet substitute teacher they had underestimated since day one stood at what now appeared to be a critical threshold, one that would reveal exactly who Araceli Frost really was and what she was capable of when pushed beyond the boundaries of ordinary classroom conflict. Time seemed to slow in room 237 as Zephyr's challenge hung in the air. The transformation in Araceli was immediate but controlled, not an emotional reaction, but a tactical shift. With precision that spoke of thousands of hours of training, she executed a simple defensive maneuver. Her right hand caught Zephyr's extended wrist, applying pressure to a specific nerve point, while her left hand simultaneously established a counterbalance. Using his own momentum and weight distribution against him, she redirected his forward motion into a controlled position where his options were immediately limited. In less than 2 seconds, Zephyr found himself secured in a hold that was impossible to break, despite his significant size advantage. His arm was immobilized in a position that applied no actual pain, but made any further aggressive movement impossible. Most shocking to the watching students was the clinical efficiency of the move. Nothing flashy or theatrical, just pure functional effectiveness. "That's enough," Araceli said, her voice completely transformed. Gone was the quiet, measured tone of the English teacher. In its place was a clear, commanding voice that carried unmistakable authority, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. Complete silence fell over the classroom. Not a single student moved or spoke as they processed the shocking revelation unfolding before them. Their substitute teacher had just neutralized the school's most intimidating student, with such skill and control that it couldn't possibly have been luck or adrenaline. This was the practiced expertise of professional combat training. Zephyr's face registered genuine fear for the first time in his high school career. The realization that he was completely immobilized by someone he had dismissed as powerless visibly shook him. His usual swagger had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable recognition that he had severely misjudged the situation. After several seconds that felt like an eternity to the watching students, Araceli released the hold with the same controlled precision she had used to establish it. "Please return to your seat," she said, her voice returning to its usual quiet clarity. Zephyr stepped back. Rubbing his wrist through the hold had caused no actual injury. His face cycled through confusion, embarrassment, and uncertainty as he tried to process what had just happened. Before he could decide how to respond, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "Who are you?" asked Lyric Washington, a normally quiet student who had been observing Araceli with increasing curiosity over the past weeks. The classroom door opened before Araceli could answer. Vice Principal Barlow stood in the doorway, having arrived for his promised check-in during fifth period. His expression indicated he had witnessed at least part of the interaction between Araceli and Zephyr. But rather than the concern or disapproval the students expected, his face showed something closer to recognition and respect. "Commander Frost," he said, addressing Araceli with unexpected formality. "May I speak with you outside for a moment?" The title sent a ripple of shock through the room. Commander? Their substitute English teacher held military rank? The students exchanged glances of disbelief as pieces began falling into place. Her posture, her unusual calm under pressure, her reflexes, the scars glimpsed on her wrist and shoulder, her vague references to specialized training environments. As Araceli stepped into the hallway with Dr. Barlow, the classroom erupted into urgent whispers. Several students immediately pulled out phones, searching for information about Commander Frost online. Others gathered around Zephyr, who stood in stunned silence, still processing what had happened. "Did you see how fast she moved? My cousin's in the Navy. Commander is like a serious rank. She totally could have hurt you, but didn't even leave a mark." Phoenix Coleman, who had warned Zephyr against pushing Araceli, looked over the shoulder of a student who had pulled up search results on her phone. "Look at this," he said, pointing to an article with a partially redacted military photograph. Araceli Frost, naval officer, specialized training program. Most of the details are classified, but it mentions an injury during an operation 3 years ago. Zephyr finally found his voice. "She's not just a substitute," he said, stating the now obvious conclusion. "She's military, special forces or something. One of the first women to complete SEAL training, according to this," added the student with the phone, scrolling through more search results. "The article doesn't say she became an actual SEAL. That part's still unclear. But she completed the training. Do you know how insanely hard that is?" The door opened as Araceli returned alone, Dr. Barlow having continued down the hallway toward the administrative offices. The class immediately fell silent again, every student now looking at their teacher with completely transformed perceptions. Where they had once seen a quiet, ineffectual substitute, they now recognized someone with capabilities and experiences far beyond what they had imagined. Araceli surveyed the room, noting the phone still displaying search results about her military career. Rather than confiscating them or acting surprised, she simply nodded once in acknowledgement. "I believe we were discussing the symbolic weight of physical objects in O'Brien's work," she said, returning to her desk and gathering the materials that Zephyr had scattered. "The example we were exploring was Lieutenant Cross's letters from Martha. Would anyone like to suggest why those letters were so significant to him during combat?" The deliberate return to the lesson plan, after what had just transpired, created a surreal atmosphere. Several students exchanged confused glances, uncertain how to proceed after such a dramatic revelation. Zephyr remained standing near the front of the room, still visibly processing what had happened. "You should probably take your seat, Mr. Dela Cruz," Araceli suggested quietly. "We still have 20 minutes of class time to use productively." Something in her tone, not threatening but firmly expectant, seemed to penetrate Zephyr's shock. He moved slowly back to his desk, every eye in the room following him. When he was seated, Araceli continued as if the confrontation had never occurred. Lieutenant Cross carried these letters as a connection to home, to normalcy, to a life beyond the chaos of war, but they also became a burden to him. Can anyone explain why? To everyone's surprise, Zephyr raised his hand. When Araceli acknowledged him with a nod, he spoke with uncharacteristic seriousness. Because they were a distraction. He was so focused on this connection to home that he wasn't fully present in his actual situation, and it got one of his men killed. A thoughtful silence followed his contribution, perhaps the first genuine academic observation Zephyr had offered all semester. Araceli nodded, the approval in her eyes visible to everyone. "Excellent analysis, Mr. Dela Cruz. That's precisely what O'Brien was illustrating, how our attachments can both sustain us and endanger us, depending on how we manage them." For the remaining minutes of class, a transformed atmosphere prevailed. Students who had never participated now raised hands to offer observations. Others who typically spent the period on their phones were actively engaged with the text. Zephyr remained uncharacteristically quiet, but his attention never left Araceli, his expression suggesting he was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. When the bell rang, no one immediately moved to leave, another first for room 237. Araceli dismissed them with a nod, and they gathered their belongings slowly, conversations hushed as they filed into the hallway. Zephyr was the last to rise from his desk, hesitating as if wanting to say something, but unable to find the words. Instead, he simply nodded once before leaving the room. The following morning, Principal Ekram Schaffer sat behind his desk, reviewing documents while Vice Principal Barlow stood near the window. Across from them, Araceli Frost sat with perfect posture, now dressed more formally than her usual teaching attire. "Your background check finally cleared," Schaffer said, closing the folder in front of him. "Naval Intelligence had quite a few redactions in the reports they were willing to share with our district." "That's standard procedure for certain operational details," Araceli replied. "What isn't standard," Schaffer continued, "is having someone with your qualifications teaching remedial English to our most challenging students. The report confirms you were one of the first women to complete SEAL training, with multiple commendations and a career-ending injury during a classified operation 3 years ago." Araceli's expression remained neutral. "The injury limited certain physical capabilities required for continued field operations, but didn't impact my ability to teach." "Why didn't you tell us?" Barlow asked. "And why choose to teach our most challenging class? With your background, you could have requested any position in the district or gone into far more lucrative security consulting." For the first time, Araceli's professional demeanor softened slightly. "My identity isn't defined by what I did before, and those students deserve someone who won't give up on them. I requested room 237 specifically because I reviewed the files and saw potential being wasted due to inappropriate teaching approaches." Schaffer leaned forward. "About yesterday's incident with Dela Cruz, standard protocol would require his suspension for threatening a teacher. The district has a zero-tolerance policy." "Suspension won't teach him what he needs to learn," Araceli said firmly. "What happened yesterday wasn't about me asserting authority through punishment. It was about revealing reality, specifically that his assumptions about power and weakness were fundamentally flawed." "You have an alternative suggestion?" Schaffer asked. "I do," Araceli confirmed. "One that aligns with both educational objectives and the development principles I utilized in military training environments." Later that day, students filtered into room 237 with none of their usual reluctance. Instead, they entered with eager curiosity, immediately noticing Araceli and Zephyr already present, engaged in quiet conversation at the front of the room. The dramatic confrontation from the previous day had spread throughout the school, transforming room 237 from the class everyone avoided to the one everyone was talking about. As the final bell rang, Araceli moved to the center of the room. The atmosphere was completely different from any previous session. Students attentive, respectful, and visibly curious about what would happen next. Yesterday was a teaching moment for all of us, Araceli began, about assumptions, about strength, about respect. In literature as in life, appearances can be deceiving, and first impressions are often incomplete. She gestured toward Zephyr, who stood and faced the class with uncharacteristic seriousness. Mr. Dela Cruz and I have had a productive conversation about yesterday's events. Rather than traditional disciplinary action, he's agreed to complete a research project on military leadership principles applied to civilian contexts, which he'll present to the class next week. The students exchanged surprised glances. This approach was unlike anything they had experienced in their academic careers. Neither the expected punishment nor a forced apology, but something that acknowledged the incident while creating a learning opportunity. Araceli continued, "Today, we'll continue our analysis of the things they carried, but with a focus on how identity is shaped by experience. O'Brien's characters are defined not just by what happens to them, but by how they integrate those experiences into their understanding of themselves." For the first time since she had taken over the class, students engaged genuinely with the material, hands raised with thoughtful questions. Connections were made between the text and real-life experiences. The discussion flowed naturally, with Araceli guiding rather than forcing their participation. "The soldiers in the book carry physical objects that represent their emotional burdens," observed Phoenix. "Like the photographs and lucky charms they think will keep them safe." "Exactly," Araceli confirmed. "The visible objects symbolize invisible weights. Like how you carried military training that nobody could see," Zephyr contributed unexpectedly. "We just saw the quiet teacher, not everything behind that." A thoughtful silence followed his observation. For a teenager often dismissed as academically disengaged, it was a remarkably insightful connection between the text and their real-world experience. "That's an excellent parallel, Mr. Dela Cruz," Araceli acknowledged. "In both literature and life, we often see only the surface of people's identities. The full weight of their experiences, their capabilities, their struggles, remains hidden unless we look deeper." The discussion continued with unprecedented depth until the final bell rang. Instead of the usual rush to escape, students lingered, reluctant to end what had become a genuinely engaging intellectual exchange. As they finally gathered their belongings and filed out, the shift in their demeanor was evident. Backs straighter, voices more measured, interactions more respectful, not just with Araceli, but with each other. Zephyr was the last to leave, approaching Araceli's desk after the others had gone. "I'm sorry for what I did," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "I didn't know who you were." "That's precisely the point," Araceli replied. "We never truly know what others have experienced or what they're capable of. That's why respect should be our starting position, not something earned through intimidation." Zephyr considered this, then extended his hand in a formal gesture, not the casual fist bump he might offer peers, but a proper handshake he had clearly researched, military style with firm grip and direct eye contact. Araceli accepted the gesture, noting, "Your real strength will show in how you treat others tomorrow and the days after." When the semester ended 3 months later, room 237 had been transformed. Attendance records showed perfect or near-perfect participation from students who had previously accumulated dozens of absences each term. Academic performance had improved dramatically, with reading comprehension scores rising an average of 37% across the class. The physical space itself reflected the change. No more graffiti on desks, books treated with care rather than disdain. Walls now displaying student work that showed genuine effort and engagement. But the most remarkable transformation was in the students themselves, particularly Zephyr, whose leadership had been redirected from disruption to constructive classroom management. Principal Schaffer stood in the doorway observing, as Araceli guided the class through their final presentations. When the bell rang signaling the end of the semester, he stepped inside while students gathered their belongings. "Ms. Frost, a moment please," he said, waiting until the room had cleared before continuing. "Mr. Bernard has decided to retire. His doctor has advised against returning to teaching. The students have petitioned for you to stay on as their permanent instructor." Araceli considered the offer thoughtfully. "I accepted this position as temporary while exploring my options after medical discharge. I hadn't planned on making it permanent. Sometimes our plans change when we discover unexpected aptitudes, Schaffer noted. Your results speak for themselves. Whatever you accomplished in your military career, what you've achieved in this classroom is equally impressive. Before Araceli could respond, voices approached in the hallway. Zephyr returned to the classroom, accompanied by Phoenix and several other students. We found this online, Zephyr said, holding out a printout of a news article about a specialized youth training program for at-risk teens based on military leadership principles. It's a pilot program starting next fall, using modified military training approaches to help students who struggle in traditional academic environments. Araceli took the paper, scanning the article with interest. You never talk about what happened to end your military career, Zephyr continued. But maybe this is why it happened, so you could be here instead. You always tell us that literature shows how experiences shape identity in unexpected ways. Maybe your experience shaped you for this. The insight, profound and unexpected from a student who had been considered unreachable just months earlier, clearly touched Araceli. Sometimes our most difficult experiences prepare us for purposes we couldn't have imagined, she acknowledged. Later that evening, after the school had emptied, Araceli sat alone in room 237, reviewing final grades and reflecting on the semester's journey. On her desk stood a framed photograph of the class, taken during their field trip to a local university's literature symposium, an event that would have been unthinkable with this group at the beginning of the term. Her phone chimed with an incoming message from a naval colleague. Position reopened in training division, specialized instruction for new candidates, interested in coming back. Araceli looked at the message, then at the classroom around her, the space that had transformed from a dumping ground for problem students to a genuine learning environment. Her gaze fell on a small plaque the students had presented to her that afternoon, engraved with words from their collaborative class project. Strength doesn't shout. It whispers in actions that speak louder than words. Her response to the message reflected not just her decision, but the lesson at the heart of her journey with these students. Already where I need to be, different battlefield, same mission. She placed the phone down beside a stack of essays submitted by students who, months earlier, had refused to write a single paragraph. On top was Zephyr's work, his final assessment of the things they carried, revealing insights into burden, responsibility, and identity that demonstrated remarkable growth. In red pen, beside her evaluation, she had written, "Your strongest weapon will always be your mind. Keep developing it." As she gathered her materials to leave, Araceli noticed the copy of The Things They Carried that Zephyr had knocked to the floor during their confrontation months ago. The book had been carefully repaired with tape, a small note inserted in the cover. "Fix this. Sorry for the damage. Thank you for seeing more in me than I saw in myself. Z." The simple message embodied everything her military training had taught her about leadership and everything her teaching experience had confirmed, that true strength lies not in dominance, but in the ability to recognize and develop potential in others. In room 237, she had found a mission as meaningful as any she had undertaken in uniform, transforming lives not through force, but through the quieter power of expectation, respect, and unwavering belief in human capacity for growth.